said, I'm Katie Campbell, the Executive Director of the Golden Ball Tavern Museum. For those of you who aren't familiar with the Golden Ball Tavern, we are a Loyalist tavern that focuses on that time pre and post American Revolution when Isaac Jones and his descendants were actively involved in what was happening, uh, what we celebrate right now, the 250th anniversary uh, of the start of the American Revolution. Isaac and his as descendants all lived in this house from 1768 until 1963, and then it became a museum. So it is a intact house with a collection that is primarily Jones related, and we get to tell the story of the family that lived there over a couple of decades. We are delighted today to share um, a lecture by Niki Lefebvre, who is the director of the Natick Historical Society, and she's going to talk about the disposition of rights and lands in Natick during the century leading up to the American Revolution. She'll also talk a little bit about the research that the Natick Historical Society is currently working on, and it's called Natick in the American Revolution, which highlights the Indigenous men who fought for the cause, a topic that's not always spoken about, and that is why we're so interested in it. This presentation is part of an exhibit that we're doing, Lost Liberties, Broken Promises, an exhibit that's focusing on the enslaved, Indigenous, and displaced Loyalists of Weston during that time, those people who were on the wrong side of the American Revolution. And it's made possible by a grant from Mass Humanities and the Mass Cultural Council. Niki has been the executive director of the Natick Historical Society since 2018. She holds a master's in public history from the University of Massachusetts Amherst and a PhD in American Studies from Boston University. The Natick Historical Society is one of the oldest historical societies in Massachusetts, and their mission is to build community by inspiring connection to local history. We are delighted to have Niki and very excited to learn about this subject matter, and we appreciate her sharing her research with us. So I hope you join me in welcoming Niki. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you, Katie. Thank you so much for having me. And it's really an honor to be with folks at the Golden Ball Tavern and with all of you here tonight. Thank you for your interest in Natick's past and present, because our perceptions or our knowledge of the past will always shape how we see the world around us today. It's what makes all history, but especially local history, so important. Before we begin, I do want to note that the bulk of this talk will focus on the established settlement of Natick in 1651 up through the Revolutionary War. That's a giant stretch of time, but it will not cover Natick before 1651. So I want to acknowledge that prior to that date, Natick had been, for generations, part of the homelands of Nipmuc people, as well as a site that was important to Massachusetts people. And 375 years later, this land is still homelands. It always will be. Also, a quick note on terms. I will use the terms Native and Indigenous interchangeably unless I know if a person is from a particular tribe. I will also refer to Natick residents when I talk about early Natick. And I want to state beforehand that all Natick residents were Indigenous until the first English family settled there. The first full-time settled family came to Natick, English family, in the 1690s. So that's nearly 2 generations after Natick was established as a praying town in 1651. The term praying town refers to the English missionary John Eliot's vision for a Puritan mission. So sometimes you'll hear me refer to mission community and praying town interchangeably too. Uh, Natick was the first praying town, but 13 others were established prior to Metacom's rebellion or King Philip's War in 1675. Punkapog, now Canton, Nashoba, now Littleton, Wamasett, Lowell, Hassanamista over in Grafton, and so on. You'll also hear me refer to the term Christian converts, also known as praying Indians. Residents of all of these towns that you see on the map here chose to begin a process of converting to the Puritan faith, and hence, in modern terms, we can call them Christian converts. And as you look at this map, it might seem as though praying towns dominated the indigenous population of southern New England. They didn't. In fact, making the choice to convert and live in a praying town was hard, and people who did so were not well liked among those who refrained from conversion. And like all Native peoples living in what became New England in the 17th century, this was a time of incomprehensible upheaval. Devastating losses from epidemics, the arrival of endless streams of English people using and using up land and natural resources rapidly and viewing the world in entirely foreign ways. In our interconnected world of the 21st century, it's impossible to imagine the kinds of shock waves, but the people of the 17th century lived it. And still, the choice to convert to Christianity was unpopular. But the people who made that choice had a wide range of reasons. So here is the current chief of Nipmuc Nation in Hassanamisco writing about this in 2021. Converts' motivations were about protection, financial security, education, access to trade, interest in English ways of life, spiritual and otherwise, and of course, land. So I've included here too a quote from John Speen. This was published by John Eliot in 1660. Speen is one of the founders of Natick, and he explained, among other things, in 1660, quote, "Because I saw the English took much ground, and I thought if I prayed, the English might not take away my ground," end quote. That is one of the lines that it stays with me, always stays with me. Now, when Katie asked me about giving this talk, she mentioned the theme of broken promises of the American Revolution. It's a powerful theme and a very important one. But when I sat down to contemplate Natick's relationship to that theme, all I could think about was the fact that by 1775, for Natick's Indigenous and Black residents, all of the promises that an English society formed on this land might have held had been broken. Solidly, heart-achingly broken. That the American Revolution was not accompanied by an expansion of rights, even for soldiers, should surprise no one. It was really part of a long pattern that goes back to the very foundation of Natick. That said, at least 41 Indigenous and Black men with ties to Natick enlisted to serve in the American Revolutionary War. That means, as of this evening, we've uncovered evidence of 41 men, to be exact, 41. And this at a time when the population of Natick was about 550 people. They comprised 18% of Natick's full complement of soldiers of all backgrounds who enlisted to serve. Now, I give you those larger numbers to underscore just how significant the number of 41 is, but I also want to offer two important caveats. First, that having ties to Natick does not mean having lived in Natick for one's whole life. And second, that enlistment among all soldiers, regardless of background, was an incredibly varied experience. On the first point, our research team has decided on two criteria to qualify a soldier as having ties to Natick. And those criteria are: one, that a soldier has a vital record attached to Natick. So that means a birth, death, or a marriage record. And two, that a soldier has a service record attached to Natick. That means a muster roll, a payroll, a town expenditure, or a pension application, and so on. Very often, a soldier checks both of these boxes and has numerous types of records attached to Natick. It is also the case that some soldiers have just one piece of evidence that ties them to Natick, and that is more common among soldiers with few resources, regardless of their background, and especially among soldiers of color who were more likely to move seasonally for work opportunities and so on. Nonetheless, one record is enough for us to have cause to honor a soldier's service. Now, onto that second point, what it means to be a soldier. And that varied greatly from person to person. So, for example, sometimes enlistment meant a long-term commitment. James Anthony, an Indigenous man with ties to Natick, served for at least 3 years in the Continental Army, and he spent time at Valley Forge, where he, like so many soldiers who spent time there, got sick and came home to recover. And you can see his muster return there on the screen. Jacob Speen, also Indigenous from Natick, whose payment record is shown here from Natick Town Meeting minutes. He served at least 3 known shorter enlistments in 1775, 1777, and 1780. And Nicodemus Gidger, like many soldiers of all ages and backgrounds from Massachusetts, he served only in 1775 that we've uncovered. And what's pictured here is a record of his marriage to Beulah Speen, a Nipmuc leader. She was they were married in the Old North Church. That's where this register comes from. And the Speen surname is really foundational to Natick because John Speen, a Nipmuc leader, was one of the town's founders. And we'll learn more about him as we go along. Before I move on, I want to thank Mass Humanities, the Massachusetts Cultural Council, and the Frank and Sheila Magullion Foundation. Their support has enabled us to assemble a fantastic team of researchers, and I really want to credit them now and applaud their work. They include Pamela Ellis, Mia Kafetz, Sean Osborne, and Fran Weiss. And we are still in the midst of our Revolutionary War project, but we've already learned so much, and Natick is really indebted to the work of this research team, and I'm so grateful to share some of what they've uncovered with you tonight. Now, I do want to come back to this figure of 41 men, and I want to make clear that I'm not arguing that these men shared any kind of experience that could be construed as a representative experience among Black and Indigenous soldiers. All evidence suggests that their experiences and enlistments varied as much as those among soldiers with English and European backgrounds. But they were tied together by one very important fact, and that did distinguish them from English soldiers. And that is that none of these men, these 41 men, had the rights of citizens either in the dissolving political structures of the English colonies or in the newly forming United States. Nor did they have citizenship rights in the town of Natick, which actually was something new. In fact, prior to 1746, Indigenous residents of Natick could vote and did hold public office, and they did so in significant numbers. And I'll come back to that later in this talk. So when we look at the service of these men, I think the burning question for me is why? And I imagine that's the case for many of you. But the spoiler is, I can't answer that for you tonight. What I would offer is that we can assume that their reasons for enlisting were as varied and complex as their experiences as soldiers. Now, some may have responded to the financial incentives or the chance for promised stability, the 3 meals a day, a roof over one's head, and so forth, except that if you've read anything about the experiences of soldiers in the Continental Army, you know that that was absolutely a promise unfulfilled. It's also possible that some men may have been looking for an adventure or a ticket out of their hometowns, and some may even have been pressured or paid to fill quotas for Army recruitment in their local communities. In Natick, we now know of at least one enslaved man of color, Caesar Thompson, whose enslaver, Samuel Wells, And yes, that's the Wells that would be the namesake of Wellesley, only were several generations prior to that. Wells sent Caesar Thompson to serve in the Continental Army for years. In fact, he marched all the way up to Canada as a soldier. And still, some men may have believed that enlisting was in the best interest of their families and that it would afford them potential future opportunities in a new nation. With such scant sources available, and believe me, our research team is still looking. I think we'll be forever looking for new sources, but we really can only speculate as to the motivations of these men. But that really is no matter because what I want to talk about tonight is what we do know about the shared history of Natick's Black and Indigenous soldiers. And that is that, in fact, they inherited and carried with them onto the battlefield a history from their fathers and grandfathers, from their mothers and grandmothers and great grandparents, even from their neighbors and friends, and from the very land on which they lived. And to understand that history that they carried, we have to go back, all the way back to early Natick. First, though, before we get all the way back to the 17th century, we do need to make a stop in the 20th century. And that's because for all of us here tonight, unless you're a descendant of early Natick, you have likely inherited and carried with you a set of stories and assumptions about early Natick that I will call Natick lore. And Natick is shrouded in this lore that is hyper-focused on the English missionary John Eliot. And if we don't start by acknowledging and pushing aside the lore, then we really run the risk of missing what is most meaningful and compelling about Natick history. And by this, I don't mean that we will leave Eliot out or leave him behind. No, he is a very important part of Natick history, but there are lots of important stories and people and events. And by acknowledging the lore, we can make room for the many other people who founded Natick and lived in it over generations. There's really no better image that captures Natick lore than the former town seal, which was changed as recently as 2023. The original image that's now on the left of your screen was created in 1951 to celebrate the town's 300th anniversary. It was officially adopted as a town seal in 1980 and was changed in the 1990s to swap out a teepee for a more historically accurate and regionally accurate wigwam. Now, this was a good change. People did live in wigwams or weetus in early Natick, not in teepees. But it was only the tiniest of steps towards improved historical accuracy. About the only other aspect of this image that approaches accuracy is the fact that there is indeed a river that flows through Natick. Today, we call that river the Charles River. The local Indigenous name was and is Quinnipiquin, which means meandering or circular, which the river certainly is. We saw a picture of it in an earlier slide, and if you've ever seen the map, you know about all those switchbacks the river makes. There is no historical record of the central figure, English minister John Eliot, preaching to local Massachusetts and Nipmuc people in the woods. By contrast, we do know that when Eliot met with local leaders, the meetings took place in pre-established, well-made, and impressive longhouses like the one pictured here, in which Eliot would have been grateful to be an invited guest. And he was such a guest in the longhouse of a Massachusetts leader named Wobbin in 1646. The town seal image also reflects popular lore that the first Algonquin language Bible, widely known as the Eliot Bible, was a product of Natick. It is not. Nor, for that matter, is it a product solely of Eliot's own hand. At least 6 known Indigenous linguists did much of that translation. Without a doubt, the Bible is a product of Eliot's vision, but he relied on linguists to realize that vision. And to this day, we don't know where the work was done. However, given that the 6 linguists represented different tribal bands and nations, and that they worked on that translation over the course of 7 years, it would be impossible to argue that the Bible was of any one place, except maybe for Cambridge, where it was printed on the press at Harvard Indian College. Moreover, in Eliot's early meetings with prospective converts, including with Wabin, there were women and children present. They were true community meetings, not meetings of men alone. And even in the years before Natick was established, some of Wabin's people and many other Indigenous people conducting trade and other transactions with the English were already wearing English clothes and hairstyles. But the greatest and most destructive inaccuracy here in this image is the assumption that local Nipmuc and Massachusetts people gathered in awe at Eliot's feet. At no point was that the case. From the very beginning, Eliot and local Indigenous leaders like Wabin and John Speen met standing eye to eye. What you see here is an excerpt from one of the Eliot tracts, and that's the name used to describe 11 pamphlets written by Eliot about his missionary work between 1646 and 1660. Now, all of these tracts must be read with a few key filters in mind. First, throughout his life, Eliot used a translator to speak with Indigenous people. So that's filter one, the translator. Second, Indigenous speakers, especially Christian converts seeking approval from English ministers, quickly grasped how Eliot would judge or respond to their words and adjusted accordingly. So that's filter two. And third, Eliot wrote these pamphlets for more than just pure documentation. He sent them back to London to raise money in support of his missionary work. And that's really important because it tells us that he wasn't likely to write much that would undermine the perception of his work back in London. So with all that in mind, what you see here is Eliot's account of the closing minutes of his first meeting with his first successful convert to Puritanism, and that is Wabin. Wabin and his followers live in what they called Kohanit. It was later called Nonantum by the English, and this is now in present-day Newton. Just before Eliot leaves Wabin's longhouse, we saw a picture of what the interior might have looked like. This is after Eliot has preached for 3 hours via his interpreter, a trusted interpreter named Cockenoe. Wabin asks Eliot to speak for his people at the Massachusetts General Court to secure their land. Quote, that they might possess all the compass of that hill upon which their wigwams then stood. End quote. And that's right from the beginning. It's not until several months later, after Eliot does talk to the Massachusetts General Court and guarantees their land, that Wabin and his followers agreed to begin converting to Puritanism. Wabin's agreement in 1646 was, in many ways, the start of Natick. It's the kind of proto-praying town, if you will. And that was not by Wabin's design. Several years later, the Massachusetts General Court decided that the English needed the lands that Eliot had promised to Wabin. Eliot managed to negotiate with Nipmuc leader John Speen for the rights to the land that was called or came to be called Natick, right at this scenic bend pictured here in the Quinnipiac River and remains today South Natick Center. Wabin's feelings about this move away from his homelands were not recorded by Eliot. But other men who took on leadership roles in Natick did discuss it, and Eliot did record some of what they said. So here's Monikesson, who explained that he did not like praying and did it because, quote, I loved the place of my dwelling, Kohanit, and I thought I will rather pray to God, end quote. So what he's telling us there is that he's converting because he wants to stay on his homelands. And later he shares, quote, after hearing that we must make a town and gather a church at Natick, my heart disliked that place. I was much troubled because I had not believed Christ, for I would not follow him to make a church, end quote. Despite his grave disappointment at leaving his homelands, Montecassin did follow Wabun and Eliot out to Natick. And in fact, he became Montecassin, the praying town's first school teacher, the praying town of Natick. So if we zoom out for a minute and come back to the theme of broken promises, you might note that here's a big one, a really big one, that the first praying town established in Natick that it was established in Natick and not Kohanit is largely because of a broken promise made to Wabun and his people. That broken promise is quite literally built into the foundation of early Natick. Natick became a fully formed praying town, which was Eliot's vision, a community for Native people who chose to convert to Puritanism and along the way also to English customs, traditions, and lifeways. The town was removed from native homelands and situated at a distance from English villages. In Eliot's mind, Natick residents were insulated from bad influences, whether those be English or Indigenous. And although early Natick is absolutely a place of English colonization and of Puritan missionization, it is also undoubtedly a Native place and a place of Native agency. One of the first things that Natick residents did was build a meeting house with a small room inside where Eliot could sleep when he visited to preach once every fortnight. That's right. Eliot never actually lived in Natick despite his strong association with the community. They also built a footbridge to easily cross the river. And from there, Natick became a place in which women wore both wampum and English-style spun cloth, a place in which a man could speak his own language, the Massachusetts language, mostly in Natick, but tilled fields and tended hogs in the English, tended to hogs in the English tradition. A place in which a home was a wigwam that held homemade cedar bark mats next to imported English tea kettles. A place in which children attended school with a teacher, Montecassin, whom we've met, who spoke their first language and taught scripture as well as the English language. Natick was a place where these tensions between English and Indigenous lifeways coexisted, if you will. But we can only use that term as long as we don't assume that equity is contained within that coexistence, because there was never any doubt that Native agency existed only within the bounds of Natick, and that Natick itself only existed within an English colonial context. So to that end, the government in early Natick was a kind of a blend of English, Indigenous, and scriptural traditions. Inspired by Mosaic law, residents elected a ruler of 100, 2 rulers of 50, and 10 rulers of 10. The system was elective, which actually was innovative for an English system at the society at the time. But it was also hierarchical enough and orderly enough to satisfy the English, these rulers. But what's really interesting is that in practice, Natick residents elected the very same rulers that they had already known and respected before coming to Natick, right? So the leaders of Natick are Wabun and Cuchumekin, another important Massachusetts leader who comes to the community a little bit later, and John Speen. They occupy the top positions of leadership in the town just as they had before the praying town was established. Natick's rulers had a lot of room to shape local governance. They oversaw behavior, they settled internal disputes, but in 1656, the Massachusetts General Court set up an external judicial system to be overseen by an Englishman, and that's Daniel Gookin. Indigenous magistrates were appointed by Gookin to hold court and render judgments. And as superintendent of Indians, Gookin oversaw all of it. He was empowered to collect tithes. He administered orders and penalties where he saw fit. And so here we see in the day-to-day lots of Indigenous political agency, but there was never any doubt who had the final say in legal matters. Excuse me, just 1 minute. Here we go. Okay. So, given how intertwined Natick residents had become in the English church and colonial structure, it should come as no surprise that when Metacom's rebellion or King Philip's War erupts in 1675, that summer, Natick families, along with the families in 13 additional praying towns, aligned themselves with the English. Mutual protection and military alliance um, had really been assumed from the beginning of the establishment of praying towns throughout southern New England. Um, People in praying towns were alienated from native peoples who did not convert, as well as from English who considered them to be enemies. Um, Men from Natick made their allegiances known readily, quickly. In fact, several months before the fighting broke out in the summer of 1675, Wabin sought out local English magistrates to let them know that he feared trouble from Metacom and his allies. Indigenous men from Natick and other praying towns served the English as guides, as informants, and as soldiers throughout the war. Records for this war are nothing like what we have for the Revolutionary War, which at the Natick Historical Society we are now steeped in. But Daniel Gookin, the Indian superintendent, he did write quite a bit about King Philip's War and noted that large numbers of men from Natick fought alongside the English and Mohegans in that war. And what's on screen here is from a 19th century history of that war, which is really grounded in Gookin's writings. And it's where we get these kind of vague references to Natick residents and other Christian converts who are fighting in these early days of the war. So very few specific names come through and emerge in these narratives, but they are important because it's one of the ways in which we know that Natick residents were there and Christian converts from other praying towns too, fighting alongside the English. Some individual names do appear in other English records too. These would include Zachary Abraham, Andrew Pitamy, James Speen, John Magus, and Tom Wodascompon, who actually earned the distinction of captain from the English for his leadership. And thereafter, he was referred to as Captain Tom. Now, despite this military service, English prejudice against all Indigenous people only increased as the war went on, especially amid rumors that Natick residents were double agents or had committed acts of war. And very often, when missions did not go well from the English perspective, other English would sort of assume that it must have been because of the duplicitousness of Christian converts. As a result, in August 1675, Indigenous people from praying towns were ordered by law not to leave their communities. Outside the bounds of Natick, any Indigenous person without an English escort could be considered an enemy and killed on the spot with impunity. So this measure undermines freedoms, but even more particularly makes it very difficult to hunt, farm, and trade beyond that tiny little community. But in October of that year, 1675, the Massachusetts General Court orders all residents in praying towns to live in confinement on Deer Island in Boston Harbor. And in Natick, residents had just 1 hour's notice to leave for Deer Island. Most of their belongings, weapons, hunting supplies, ammunition, food that had been stored, clothing, it was all left behind. And once vacant, the town of Natick was ransacked by English neighbors, and a generation's worth of private property, a season's worth of food stored, was never restored, never gained back. Sentencing people to indefinitely to Deer Island was framed as a measure of protection of Christian natives against vengeful English, and the protection of English against natives, whose loyalty some believed could be turned at any moment. Still, it's hard to view the court's decision as anything other than a betrayal of a generation of Indigenous people who committed so deeply to living in English societies, learning the English faith, and ultimately fighting in an English war. And I do want to note here, I think it's important that neither John Eliot nor Daniel Gookin, the Indian superintendent, condoned this measure. In fact, both opposed it vigorously, but didn't have the influence to change what was seen really as a protective war measure by the general court. And in the end, when the general court at last allowed Native people who survived the winter on Deer Island to leave, it was Eliot and Gookin who transported them back to the mainland at their own expense. Now, estimates about Deer Island vary, but hundreds of people spent a harsh winter on Deer Island with no provisions, no shelter, no proper clothing, and always under English surveillance. Those who survived did so mostly by eating clams, but many, many people died of starvation, disease, and exposure to the cold. I've talked to and learned from descendants of families who survived Deer Island who feel in their being that they are survivors of genocide. And for today's descendants of early Natick and other praying towns, Deer Island may have happened 350 years ago, but it is not history. Over the course of that winter, 1675 to 1676, some men took opportunities to leave the island and continue their service as scouts, soldiers, and spies for the English. These opportunities were really dangerous. Captain Tom of Natick, who I mentioned earlier, for example, he had earned that distinction of the rank of captain, but he came under the suspicion of two English people who thought they saw him in alliance with Metacom. And despite Tom's testimony, despite character references from other Natick residents, including James Rumney Marsh, Tom was convicted and hanged for treason. And others who took such risks were killed, and some captured and sold into slavery. So the risk of continuing to serve the English during the war and leave Deer Island came with significant costs for many. King Philip's War remains the bloodiest war per capita, that is, casualties relative to the population at the time, in American history, and that includes the American Civil War. It is a grim and complex story to tell, and it is one that is not told nearly enough, even here on this land in which we move every day. It is not told enough. So this year, as we all remember the 250th anniversary of the American Revolutionary War, I urge all of us not to forget that it is also the 350th anniversary of a war that shaped our nation too, and at terrible cost to those who lived through it and their descendants. Remarkably, when the war was over, Christian converts who survived did return to Natick, and they began to rebuild. Historian Jean O'Brien, to whom we are all indebted for her work on Natick, she quite literally wrote the book on Natick, and if you're interested, I can send the title. She once wrote that, quote, "Indians who came to Natick remained committed to the community and to the native strategies it represented. Once it had come together Natick did not easily come apart, end quote. And she was right. Natick did rebuild and hold together for a few more generations before it became a majority English community in the middle of the 1700s. And that changed the course of Natick's future. As soon as 1679, this is just 3 years after the end of Metacom's rebellion or King Philip's War, Natick's boundaries were redrawn with 4,000 acres granted to Sherburne. Now, this was an equal and agreed upon exchange overseen by Natick's elected native rulers, and as well as with the approval of Daniel Gookin and John Eliot. But and I will say that as part of that transaction, land was given back from Sherburne to establish a school for people living in Natick, a Massachusetts language school, no less. So, nonetheless, in the wake of that transaction, several additional land transactions had not met quite that same level of support. After that, Natick reorganized. So in 1682, a general agreement was set in place in which no land in Natick could be sold without the consent of all proprietors. This model, it could be known as it's a corporate model or communal ownership. All the land in Natick was considered to be corporate, and this corporate model was very difficult to maintain and to govern, especially as land passed to a second generation. So, for example, John Owasamug took ownership of his own lands in Natick in 1684 with the approval of the corporation. His son and daughter-in-law, Thomas and Abigail Owasamug, inherited these lands 7 months after John Owasamug died. But the couple had incurred so much debt supporting the elderly father during his illness and then in death that they had to sell the land to discharge that debt. The sale to the Englishman, his name was Edward Rawson, was approved by the general court because the Owasamugs were seen to have native rights to the land. And the Natick Land Corporation, by community agreement, sort of also approved it out of respect for the family and because the land just fell right outside the bounds of the interior praying town. And so that's an example of the kind of land transaction that happens even in this corporate model. Throughout the 1680s, Natick residents approve other land sales to Englishmen, typically with the expectation that the new landowners supply public works. So Thomas Sawin's grist mill, that's not what's pictured here. I wish I had an illustration or a drawing of that, but this is a reproduction at Sturbridge Village. Thomas Sawin's grist mill is probably the best known example of this type of transaction. So he sets up a grist mill along the Quinnipiquin or Charles River in exchange for the land to do that. And the Sawin family eventually moves to the site in the 1690s. They become the first full-time English family living in Natick. Another example, an Englishman and carpenter named John Collar becomes an early English resident of Natick because he came in 1699 to help build a new meeting house. And in exchange for that, he receives 200 acres to live in the community. These transactions were seen as reciprocal, and they were welcomed by the members of the mission community, by Natick residents. But other transactions that were seemingly set up to support public works really did not go as smoothly. Early on, two men named John Grout and Matthew Rice secured approval for 50 acres of land. But privately, they petitioned individuals to increase those 50 acres to 500 acres. And those acres did cross into the boundaries of the praying town. right? So we have an increase from 50 acres to 500. Samuel Gookin Jr. and Thomas Howe similarly received approval for 200 acres of land in Natick in 1682. But by 1694, Thomas Sawin complained to the General Court that Gookin and Howe had amassed not 200 acres, but 1,700 acres. And moreover, that they had sold 1,200 of those acres to other Englishmen, several, without approval of the native corporation charged with the right of approval. So there's little that a court could do to reverse these transactions, though they did try to make some substitutions. But the parcels that Gookin and Howe sold off to other Englishmen amounted to 8.5 times the size of the original approved transaction. So those are two early examples of how land sort of starts to begin to become dispossessed. Yet, despite this, in the early 1700s, Natick continued to be a place of native agency, albeit within an increasingly English-dominant context. When John Eliot died in 1690, he ordained an Englishman named Daniel Takawamba to take his place at the head of the English church. Massachusetts remained the primary language of Natick, though more and more English was spoken. And most people in the early 1700s retained two names, one native and one English. Natick residents retained the first governance system of rulers of 150 and so on after Metacom's Rebellion or King Philip's War. It's not until around 1707 that they adopt an English-style select board system. Select board members become the new local leaders, and they're all Indigenous in 1707, and many of the surnames harken back to the first families who settled the praying town in 1651. Natick today might be the only town in the Commonwealth of Massachusetts to claim that none of the first select board members were English. In fact, they were all Indigenous. So it's not really until 1720 that we begin to see native residents start replacing wigwams with English-style homes and farms. And that is also the year that Natick shifted from a corporation of landowners, that communal process of approving land transactions. They shifted from that to an English proprietor system in which individuals held deeds to plots of land that were owned and sold with no need of community approval. Now, the system is very complicated. It takes years for this transition to occur. There are all kinds of legal qualifications into how this is done, and I will not get into that tonight, but you can read Jean O'Brien's book. She's written chapters about it, and it's fascinating. But what happens here, what you see here on the screen is a map that is in the collections of the Natick Historical Society, and it represents the painstaking research of a man named Horace Mann, who was an early member of the Natick Historical Society, and he plotted. You can see the detail on the right side of the screen. He plotted the original landowners from that shift in 1720 onto a map of Natick that dates to 1874. So for his era, the late 19th century, it's a contemporary map with the plots of Indigenous landowners dating roughly to the 1720s and 30s. It's unclear why this shift in land ownership, the system occurred. There is some evidence to suggest that there was pressure from English landowners and neighbors, but it also happens within a larger transition for the town of Natick. Regardless, the shift opened the floodgates to generate a bustling land market in Natick. Nearly 1,800 acres of land, about a third of the town, changed hands between 1720 and 1740. 1/3 of the whole town. And between 1730 and 1740, 75% of all those land transactions involved the discharging of debt. This is not unlike the story of the Awasamugs from the 1680s and is a frequent inducement for land transactions in Natick. Um, with this major land exchange came a devastating loss of rights. So in 1720, English landowners began, for the very first time, winning elected offices in the town. Prior to that, all office holders had been Indigenous. Um, in the 1720s, a handful of English elected officials serve alongside native Natick residents. And even in 1730, Native residents still hold 98% of all elected seats in town, the select board, and any other position, such as a constable and so forth. But with more English people becoming landowners in Natick, um, by 1740, 40% of all elected offices in Natick are held by English people. So within 10 years, we go from nearly 100% of office holders being Native to 40% of those offices being held by English people. And by 1746, English residents become a full majority of the population in the town. And this indeed was devastating for Natick's Indigenous residents. Um, they had enjoyed the right to vote and the right to hold office in Natick for nearly a century. But with so many English landowners, Natick entered a new legal status within the English political system. It was no longer a protected plantation as it had been for 100 years. It would become a parish. And that distinction formally excluded all Indigenous people from political power of any kind in Natick. So, with that flip of percentage of landowners, 100 years of voting rights and holding offices was erased seemingly overnight. And this map, this is where we began the presentation. This map is called the Livermore map. It was surveyed in 1750 by Samuel Livermore. And this is done just a few years after that devastating shift in Natick's political status. And it's not an uncontroversial map. In fact, Indigenous Natick residents contested this map, and they argued that it underrepresented the number of Indigenous individuals living in Natick. And as you know, they had a lot at stake in doing so and documenting their population. But for our purposes here tonight, the map can tell for us a slightly different story. All of the yellow dots you see represent the homes of Indigenous and some Black families living in Natick in 1750. A good number of these homesteads would, just a generation after losing their long-held political rights, they would send sons, husbands, and fathers to enlist in the Revolutionary War. Now, some of the men who fought in the Revolutionary War may have remembered a time when they could vote. Others who fought would almost certainly have learned about those political rights and the loss of those rights from their fathers, grandfathers, neighbors, friends. But still, they went. And today, 250 years later, we are all the better for understanding their sacrifice and the stories that they carried with them into battle. So Natick's history may be riddled, as we've seen, with broken promises, but it is certainly not defined by broken hopes. And with that, I thank you for your time, and I'm happy to answer any questions.
Hi there. I just thank you so much, Nikki. That was incredible. I'm still digesting so much. But to all of you out there, if you have a question, you can either put it in the chat or the Q&A, and Nikki would be happy to answer it for you. Um, I don't think I can unmute people, or maybe I can and I don't know how, but I'm here if you have any questions. Let me have a look what we've got. We still just have all our um, everybody's still on right now.
Okay.
And Katie, do you have any
Oh,
questions, by the way? Because you were also here. If you want to turn on your video,
I
you
don't
can.
have any, well, I do have questions, but um, this was fantastic, Nikki. I can't thank you enough. I learned so much, but I think the takeaway for me was how much Natick changed in such a short period
Mhm.
of time, and seriously, how much uh, how much evolution from something that was so pure into something that was diluted is evident in both your maps and your story. Um, I, I I had no idea, and I'm so happy that you shared this history with us because now I just want to learn more. And I hope other people felt the same way.
oh, good. I'm glad. My hope is always Natick is a very complicated place, and whenever I have the opportunity to talk about it, my hope is not that people walk away feeling like they have answers, but that people walk away feeling like they've got many, many more questions and need to check out a book and learn more. Um, because I think its history just raises some really foundational questions about what it means to be a community and what it means to be human and how history can inform the present. So,
Yes.
yeah.
Well, I've got a
You
couple
can give
questions
us the
coming,
name
Nikki.
of the texts that you were referring to. I'm sure that many of our listeners would love to learn more based on
Yeah.
the research
Yeah,
that's
I can
been
send them
done.
in a follow-up. I can send those in a
Yeah.
follow-up email if we get that. And I do have a couple questions. I don't want us to run out of time. Cindy is asking, did anybody live along the river before they moved here? If that makes sense.
I'm taking that as before there was a praying town established in 1651. Did anyone live along? Yes. The area of Natick, the area that is now that today is Natick, um, was and is the homelands of Nipmuc people, and particularly John Speen and his followers. So when Elliot actually realizes they have to move and he comes looking for new land, he negotiates first with John Speen for the rights to that land, which is now Natick, because that he is acknowledged to be kind of the leader of that area at that time. So yes, and had been Nipmuc homelands a long time before 1651.
Mm, of course. So we have another question about the books, which I will definitely pass that on. Scott is asking, what was Natick's relationship with surrounding towns during the early years? If you know that.
Yeah, that's a great question. I can tell you, as you heard in the talk, I did reference that there was a very uh, mutually kind of a reciprocal transaction with Sherburne, and I think that there's evidence of kind of a positive relationship. Dedham is, I would say, Dedham and Natick have a very tough history because right from the beginning, when John Speen grants Eliot the rights to the land, Massachusetts General Court also grants Eliot the rights to the land, even though how they imagine themselves to have those rights to give is another story entirely. But Dedham contests it, and they contest that Natick can set up where it does. That in fact Cuchamacan had given them rights to that land before Natick arrived, and that goes on for the first 10 or 15 years of Natick's history, and even comes back after King Philip's War. So. That's kind of a tough transaction. Dedham is the mother town of so many towns, right? And so, in a strange sense, many towns around here have a relationship with Dedham. A couple of the other neighboring towns sort of had not come into existence yet at the time of early Natick.
Cool. I'm just going to see, and you're okay with we'll exchange an email with these books, and then I can send them in a
Yes.
file.
And I'll just mention if
Perfect.
somebody wants to Google, as soon as we end here, if you Google Jean O'Brien Dispossession by Degrees, that's really a key resource for us at the Natick Historical Society. And I glossed over about 100 pages of her book in a single page of talking about those land transactions because they are everything to the history of Natick, but they are also really complicated. If that's of interest to you, you definitely want to check out her book.
Wonderful. And have Martha Mahart saying, well done, Nikki. Looking forward to talking to you soon.
Thank you, Martha.
Joe Green says, thank you. I enjoyed this lecture very much. And if there are
Thank you,
any other
Joe.
questions, now is the time. But it
One
looks
more
like,
question.
oh, go ahead.
All right. So, Nikki, in the Weston town records, we found a number of Indigenous people from Natick who were married in Weston and not,
Mm.
and we wondered why. If it was because was it strictly a location issue, or was it that they didn't want to be married by the church in Natick for some reason? Um, but there's quite a number of them, and we have those names listed. Do you have any sense of why that was?
Yeah, well, so I'd have to look at the dates, and that would tell us something. But there is a shift in the so Natick, as I mentioned, John Eliot had been its minister. When he died, a man named Daniel Tecumseh took over. He died in 1716, and in 1720, there's an English minister for the first time. And so Native people's relationship to the church changes a little bit. There are also a number of land transactions with Needham that ultimately shift the center of the town to what is today's Natick Center when the church is moved. But there are a lot of kind of macro shifts that do affect Indigenous people's relationship to the church in Natick. And I would also say that, people I'd love to see the records. People
Or
just,
you,
people just, we have also inherited this idea that people were very sedentary and lived in a single town for their whole lives, and that's just absolutely not the case, really. Even for a whole lot of people with English and European backgrounds, there's just more movement than we imagine there to be, and that's especially so in places where a people's foothold on land is not as steady as it might have been.
Wow.
Yeah. I'll just mention quickly that if you're interested in following our Revolutionary War project, we'll be releasing news about that in the coming weeks. But we will be doing traveling memorials of featuring an honored roll of all of Natick's Revolutionary War soldiers, as well as a companion website to tell some of the stories of some of the men that I talked about, as well as many others. So follow us if you don't already, and definitely learn what's going on with the Revolutionary War in Natick.
Wonderful. Just one more. A lot of people saying thank you for an excellent and informative talk. Everybody seemed to have been very happy with what we got to learn from you in this short hour.
Oh, thank
And
you.
yeah, and Katie, I'll let you finish up here if you want.
again, I just want to thank Nikki and the Natick Historical Society for sharing their research. I know it's ongoing, and we feel privileged to be part of, your process. And we look forward to learning more. And we will definitely tune in to your research findings. So, thank you,
Thank
Nikki,
you.
for your evening. We really enjoyed it,
Mm.
and thank you. And come to visit the Golden Ball.
Would love
Yeah,
to. Thank
yeah,
you so much, and thank you everyone for your hour. Thank you.
yeah. Thank you for coming. There's so many people who just were so happy to be here. I can see that. Thank you so
Great.
much.